Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. Welcome to the Sulaimaan Ravat show. We are live with you this Friday evening from our studios here in Sunning Hill, Johannesburg. Now, yesterday was SONA 2020, the State of the Nation address, delivered by President Cyril Ramaphosa about 1.5 hours late. Well, I'm sure you were following proceedings either on the radio or watching it on the TV, and if you weren't, you know what happened. There was... Some people were referring to it as drama, others were referring to it as a circus. Most people seem to be disappointed by the antics of the EFF. They did what they did. They delayed proceedings. Many were caught by surprise when the speaker said that the House is going to be suspended, unlike previous years where they were just thrown out and then they came back. And we'll talk about that in the latter part of the program. But the first part of the program, we want to talk about the SONA itself, the message of the president, the address of the president. One sentiment I picked up in the lead up to the State of the Nation address, and today as well, is people seem to be somewhat indifferent to the State of the Nation address. Some people feel, well, what difference does it make? Once a year he's got to give the speech, he gives the speech, he says a whole lot of things, he makes promises. Is he really going to deliver? Is it really going to make a difference? Is it going to positively impact on the economy and on Eskom and the load shedding and all of those kind of things? A bit of a simplistic viewpoint, some may argue, but that's how people feel. And I think we will address that during the course of the program. People's indifference, their lack of confidence, whether his speech actually managed to change that somewhat. But he's the president. Whether you like him or not, whether you vote for him or not, he's the president. And he sits on the ultimate seat of power. His party is the ruling party. Their decisions impact on you and I, whether we agree with their politics, we disagree with their politics, whether we are interested or whether we are indifferent. And hence, we have to discuss these issues and try and understand these issues because we are citizens of this country. And our interests are at stake, our individual interests, as well as our collective interests as communities, as well as the broader citizenry of the country. We have two guests on the program this evening. The first is with us in studio already, and that is the Executive Director of S03, Mohammed Kaji. The other, Ralph Mateja, a political analyst, will join us a little later in the program, inshallah. Mohammed, as always, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Always a pleasure to be here.
Let me start on a bit of a personal note. Have you also become a little indifferent? Was your mindset and your thought processes, was it also somewhat, I don't know, negative before the State of the Nation address? That is he really going to speak that which will make a difference? Because on one hand, you're a human, you're a citizen. On the other hand, you also have a very deep interest in political happenings. Does the circumstances impact on the psyche and the mindset of a citizen of South Africa ahead of a big address like this?
Absolutely, Moulana. And I'll use an analogy to answer your question, right? We had President Ramaphosa come into office in 2018. He brought us Tuma Mina and the New Dawn. And for me, the answer to that is yesterday was meant to be high noon. You know, it was the showdown. So now we're at the point where citizens are indifferent. They feel that they've given the president a lot of time to start showing changes. There's an impatience that's coming in terms of the economy specifically and the ability to turn around the situation where actions are more important than promises. So yeah, for me, the feeling going into SONA yesterday is that it's high noon and it's time to see specific, bold actions on the part of the president. And some of the political cartoons coming into it, you know, showed the president looking for a backbone, looking for a spine. You know, that's part of the commentary that's going around it, that the president needs to step in and take control of the party and take control of the narrative and not try to please everybody.
How do we reconcile this with the latest ratings of the president? And this is a question I was also asking as we were reporting live from SONA yesterday. On the one hand, we pick up on the sentiment and we hear the sentiment being expressed that the Ramaphosa has now kind of dwindled. People are no longer so patient. They're getting frustrated with him. They feel that he now needs to develop a backbone, not be so consultative and try and be so broad-based in keeping everyone happy. But then on the other hand, he's got a 62% rating, which is fairly high. Of course, it's dropped from 70% at the height in 2018, but one would expect it to be a little lower than that in line with that sentiment, in line with South Africans living with load shedding, something that they've never had to deal with before?
Look, he's not a dismal president. He's not a terrible president, right? He's a methodical president. He goes through processes and he goes through a specific kind of methodology. If you look at the way he works, he goes through this methodology of consultation and bringing everybody on board and moving ahead. So there haven't been dramatic failures in terms of his presidency, and there have been successes. The problem we have is that there's a specific issue related to time. And if you look back to Mandela's presidency, okay, Mandela came into office in '94. The RDP was brought in 2 years later in 1996. And there was this political capital that the ANC and Mandela had during that time. With Ramaphosa coming off the Zuma administration, and specifically the economic crisis that we're in, that's where the impatience stems from, because you have employment numbers. You know, I saw some numbers yesterday relating to the employment numbers when he took office 2 years ago, and the employment numbers now, which went up 3% in the standard definition of unemployment. So the trouble is that he isn't in the situation where there's a kind of up curve in terms of sentiment in the public and so on. There were big expectations on him. It's a big job that he's had as president to try to address. And like I said, his presidency hasn't been a failure. You know, he's dealt with the National Prosecuting Authority. He's dealt in some respects with state capture. There haven't been arrests, but he has dealt with state capture. There is some semblance of rebuilding of the state that we're starting to see. But that impatience really comes in terms of time, like the running out of time with relation to the ratings agencies, with regard to youth unemployment, the economy, and specifically Eskom and electricity and energy supply. So, you know, that's really the cards that he's been dealt.
Before we even get to talk about your overall impressions on the speech and some of the key elements of the speech, did it make it more difficult for him that we had 3 State of the Nation addresses in a period of 12 months? You had SONA February 2019, then you had the SONA in June because of the elections that came, and now you've got SONA February 2020. So in a 12-month period, he's actually had to deliver 3 State of the Nation addresses, the second one now in the same financial year. Does it make it a bit more difficult because now there's this expectation and the period of delivery is much smaller and narrower as compared to the normal one speech after 12 months?
Yeah, it does. It makes it really difficult. What also makes it difficult for him is, remember, when he came into office, his first State of the Nation was really a few weeks after Jacob Zuma was recalled.
People were just relieved to see somebody else besides Zuma.
You know,
yeah.
And he inherited a cabinet that was pretty much Zuma's team, that he couldn't change until the election last year. So those first 2 State of the Nation addresses of his would have meant that he had very little room to maneuver in terms of the team, the expectations of the team. You know, he had people like Batabile Dlamini and others within his cabinet still. And then, you know, so now he comes into office, he's elected, he does his SONA, he has his own team, and now 6 months later, he's delivering another SONA. So yes, it makes it difficult that you have to do 2 SONAs in 1 year and then 3 within 12 months. On the part of the citizens, obviously, it's helpful because now you have more closer time periods in terms of being able to measure what's been said, and we have this debate more regularly rather than every 12 months. And perhaps that's why we're much more tough on him and on the delivery in terms of his administration because of those reduced time periods of 6 months rather than 12 months on a cycle.
Do you notice, well, he's a much better speaker, at least when he's reading off a script than Zuma. But we know that it's not the president who takes his pen and writes the speech from beginning to end. How much has changed in the tone and the structure of that speech? We're not talking now about his oratory style or the delivery part of it. We know how short Zuma fell in that regard. But in terms of the actual content.
Look, Mbeki was known to be very involved in his speech writing. And to have a specific kind of hand in the narrative that he was weaving and, you know, the quotations that were used and so And I think Cyril's very much the same, you know, coming from a law background, the choice of quotations and the choice of kind of narrative on his part, I think he has a very strong hand in terms of that. Other elements in the speech, like, you know, when he got into the issues around data in the speech, you kind of realized that this stuff was potentially put in there without really being looked at specifically in terms of the impact that it would make. But I think on the whole, most presidents would weave the speech together and adapt the speech into their kind of personality and the kind of presidents that they are in their own kind of leadership styles. And very much in his speech, you can see that there's elements that come from the different departments that are put into the speech, which is the nature of a SONA address, because you're essentially putting forward what the plan of action is for the 12 months, what the different departments are going to be doing. But for him, there's a specific interest that he has in the infrastructure fund, for example, so that gets more kind of paragraphs within the speech, a particular interest in electricity across the board, and that gets an entire page in the speech. And then there's the other bits that kind of get, you know, paragraphs or just lines and mentions in the speech. And, you know, maybe not in the South African context, but most likely that departments or ministers getting specific lines into the speech for themselves is seen as an achievement on their part, that they got into, you know, the State of the Union address in the case of the Americans, or the State of the Nation address in the case of ourselves in South Africa. So that really is the kind of view for the 12 months in terms of the administration, which is why it's so important. And there's this lobbying that goes about in advance of the speech to make sure that there's lines that get added to the speech from the different ministers or from the different departments.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that he is very hands-on in terms of the crafting of the speech. Yesterday when we were at Parliament and they held a media briefing, the question being asked by the media is, when will we get a copy of the speech? The media get a copy of the speech in advance, but obviously it's embargoed. And in the Zoomer times, used to get it a good half an hour, 1 hour before he actually started to deliver the speech. You could line up all of your tweets, you know, as drafts. And the question being asked on the media was, why are we getting it so late? And the response was that right until just before he steps into the car, he's still making changes. He's still making adjustments to the speech. And therefore, when we get the copy, that's the only time that we can share it. Okay, it's time for our first break. When we come back, inshallah, we continue the analysis on SONA 2020. Welcome back. So we are unpacking SONA. We're doing an analysis of SONA. I was there yesterday, landed at the airport, came directly here. A bit tired, somewhat frustrated because of what happened yesterday, but we'll get to that. All right, so getting into the speech proper. Overall, was it pretty much what you expected?
I think so. I think the expectation was that there'll be specific themes in the speech. And we had a general idea of what would come out specifically relating to energy, because, you know, there were discussions around it at the ANC Lekgotla and the government Lekgotla. Electricity supply, youth unemployment, the presidential infrastructure fund. So those were the kind of known themes, the national health insurance. You know, there were typical themes that you've seen in previous SONA addresses, and we figured that those would come about. The only thing for me is, you know, and I mentioned this earlier, that I felt, considering the nature of the economic crisis that we're in, the speech needed more of that tonality within it, you know. And I felt that the speech kind of delivery and, you know, the smiles and the kind of more happiness within the speach kind of sent the message, okay, you know, things are fine, things are under control and so on. But really, we're sitting at a very critical part in this whole situation, which I describe as high noon. So for me, yeah, you know, in terms of content of the speech, pretty much as expected, no real or major surprises within it, which is good, I guess, for the markets, good for the ratings agencies, good for all of those who are watching it and don't get anything like, dramatic off-policy.
Going back to what I was saying right at the beginning, for the man on the street, the question in their mind, we can say it's simplistic, but that's the question in their mind. Okay, economy, what did he specifically say that's going to make a difference? Economy being a theme and ESCOM and SOEs being a theme, that's pretty much a given. He's got to touch on those things. But in terms of policy changes or in terms of specifics, whether it's the power supply, whether it's electricity, whether it's the economy currently, was there something there that gives hope, that makes us that gives us an indication that he's got a workable plan?
Look, on reliable energy supply, and reliable energy supply is critical because the entire economy is premised on that. The policy proposals, or let's call them policy decisions now, because really they've been discussed at La Khotla and so on. I think those are real in terms of the ability to actually turn things around. The game changer in some respects is the opening up of commercial and industrial users to build energy supply for themselves over 1 megawatt without the levels of regulation that were in previously. Because previously, any commercial or industrial entity that wanted to install energy supply over 1 megawatts for their factories or for their mines and so on needed to get a license. And now that license requirement has essentially been lifted within the speech a timeline to say they have to be turned around within 120 days. And that's really one of the quickest ways to get energy onto the grid. The other workable plan was negotiating with current renewable energy suppliers and independent power producers to expand their production of electricity, because they're already connected to the grid, they already have installed capacity, and as part of their license requirements, they'd be supplying a specific amount of energy that was negotiated with the Department of Energy for their specific blocks. So there is excess capacity there that potentially can be fed into the grid. Another game changer is allowing municipalities that can afford it, and our wealthy municipalities such as Johannesburg, Cape Town, Pretoria, Durban possibly, can install IPPs and contract IPPs under their own balance sheet. So now you don't need to depend on ESCOM to be funding IPPs or the Department of Energy to be funding IPPs. Municipalities as entities themselves have a revenue stream that comes in from rates and taxes and the collections that they make. So them being able to install energy supply would then take pressure off the grid and allow surplus electricity. Because remember, with electricity supply, we're not just talking about supplying the current need of electricity, but you also need to plan ahead for economic growth. That if you don't have surplus energy capacity in 5 or 10 for 5 or 10 years, then the big manufacturers or big manufacturing enterprises and even small manufacturing enterprises will say, well, we can't plan for manufacturing a specific amount of product over a period of years because we don't know that we have reliable energy supply. So we rather invest our money elsewhere or keep it in a bank and wait for the situation to improve. So I think on energy, the policy proposals also opening up another window for renewable energy, which takes 18 to 24 months to come onto the grid versus a Kusile or Madupi or big coal power generating plants that take multiple years, 5 to 10 years for them to come on stream. On energy, really a workable plan. On youth unemployment, I felt it was quite fluffy, at least the first. He came up with 6 interventions. Out of the 6, the workable ones were where he said that 1% of the budget is going to be specifically dedicated towards addressing youth unemployment. And that 1% of the budget is going to go towards the Youth Employment Initiative that we know has been working, which is a partnership between government and the public sector to take unemployed youth into internships in the private sector. And then the fluffy part of it was this thing about they're going to be providing short course training and set up these pilot sites and so on. And my critique of that is, there's already a 1% plan, which is 1% of the entire country's payroll that's going towards the skills development levy that's been funding the SETAs, and the SETAs as an entire kind of industry have really not made the impact that we've seen. So now saying additional pilot sites to do short courses for unemployed youth in a situation where the economy isn't growing jobs is, a bit of a stretch.
Coming back to the issue of electricity, all the talk about the social compact and now the whole controversy as to whether they're going to raid government employee pension funds to bail out Eskom.
Yeah, so the background to this is that Eskom's sitting on 450 billion rand in debt. So they're not a going concern. And as not being a going concern, they require constant bailouts from the Treasury and from the Fiscus to be funding the deficit within the Eskom annual budget. So government has to find a way to make sure that Eskom can balance its books on an annual basis without needing bailouts from the Treasury. The problem is that the Treasury can't loan more money because we're sitting at a 70% of debt to GDP. So they can't keep lending money to bail out Eskom because that would impact on ratings. So government really has to find money in return for equity in Eskom that would reduce that debt on the balance sheet, allow Eskom to balance its books so that it doesn't need constant bailouts from government. And the kind of easiest access to capital that government has is the pensions of workers. And we're talking not about current workers, it's workers that are still alive from whenever, 20, 30 years ago of retirement, in terms of civil servants, municipal workers, public servants, etc. All of those who are part of the government employee pension fund. Now the catch-22 with this whole thing is that if government doesn't make the intervention with Eskom in terms of balancing Eskom's books, that's going to trigger the ratings agencies to downgrade us to junk, which would then trigger a recession, which triggers losses on the JSE and losses in terms of or depreciation in terms of the rand and so on. And then you get to a situation where the pensions are worth less anyways, because the government employee pension fund is 100% invested into the South African economy through the JSE and other companies. So here's your catch-22, which is, do you use the state pension money to bail out Eskom effectively in return for equity with promises of investment returns and so on, which buys you time to implement this, interventions with regards to reliable energy supply and so on, and try to boost economic growth? Or do you not do that and trigger a ratings event sooner, as soon as March this year or August this year, which then triggers that recession and the capital flight and everything else that's associated with it. And then you see that depreciation on the JSE and of everyone's pensions much sooner. And really, if you look at the two options, the better of the two evils is this one, which is really why government and business and COSATU are all sitting at the table working this through, and have now termed it in very nice kind of, happy language of being called a social compact. But really what it is a raid on the pension fund to buy time for the economic turnaround that we need to see.
Apart from the aspects that we've covered, what were some of the other aspects that stood out for you in terms of your speech? Some of the discussion points I saw this morning around data, speaking about Lanseria again and developing it into this world-class city.
Look, something real for me that stood out was the business registration in one day. I think it's not a big thing for South Africans, but it does kind of send a message that South Africa's becoming more efficient in terms of doing business, and it would impact on our rating, on our ranking when it comes to the ease of doing business. I think the messaging around the infrastructure fund, when I think it was in the first State of the Nation address, or maybe the second one, where he said he wants to raise this 1 trillion rand in investment into the South African economy and start have the presidential infrastructure summit with regards to shovel-ready projects, and all of the companies and so on needed to come to the party and say these are the projects that we had. So it was nice to see him coming back and saying, look, out of that entire process, these were the shovel-ready projects that are there, and part of that was student accommodation. 64 billion rand needed in terms of government money matched with private money for student accommodation. Because if we're realistic about it, the construction industry is probably one of the bigger job creators in terms of the ability to create jobs that are low skilled and that are easy to bring on stream and to take off stream. And the construction industry, after the building kind of flurry around the Soccer World Cup, effectively now is in the negative or in the red. So being able to stimulate the construction industry with infrastructure projects and projects that create jobs in terms of construction jobs would probably be one of the easier than technology jobs, because our economy isn't geared towards technology jobs. So when you're speaking about smart hubs, technology hubs, and so on, and you look at the commentary around it, such as, well, every school's going to have coding, for example, by 2022, and then the critique will be, but kids are still crossing rivers, they're still going to put latrines, and now you're going to introduce coding into those schools, but the schools don't even have toilets. And I guess it's a bit of a cynical kind of critique, because even a kid who goes to a pit latrine and has to walk over a river to school, who's taught to code, could potentially be a brilliant data scientist or something in the future. But it shows the dilemma that the president's in, because there's this first world kind of economy vision that he has of where the entire world is heading, but the realities on the ground that he also needs to face.
Time for our next break. When we come back, we start talking about the EFF and the disruption that they caused at SONA yesterday. Welcome back. So we're doing an analysis of yesterday's State of the Nation address. In the first half of this program, we've been talking about the speech itself and some of the salient points and unpacking that with Mohammed Kaji, the Executive Director of S03. Now we talk about what happened before the President even started his speech. The EFF had already put him on notice saying, you don't fire Praveen Gordhan, we're not going to allow you to speak. And they followed through on that. But they caught people by surprise somewhat. That first point of order, when they said there's a murderer in the house, everyone thought they would be referring to Ramaphosa in the context of Marikana. And then they point out to de Klerk. On the top there, he was sitting together with Kgalema Motlanthe and Thabo Mbeki. What did you make of that moment, that de Klerk angle? It seemed to have caught, in the house, it seemed to have caught many people by surprise.
Look, I think politically, it was smart of the EFF. It caught everyone by surprise, but basically, what then happened was that the speaker had to defend the entire issue of de Klerk being in the house. And the EFF kind of played that to say, oh, look, the ANC is protecting de Klerk, and this is the party, and this is the party that you have. So in terms of that, they were quite kind of smart about it, because in terms of the parliament and him being a former deputy president of the country and so on, there was kind of this decorum that he's been invited continuously on an ongoing basis since the first democratic parliament, right? And, on a technicality, they might actually be right that, as a deputy president in democratic South Africa, he may not be recognized any longer as a president. I haven't delved into it, but somebody else might be able to delve into it. But the sunset clauses that were negotiated at CODESA and so on potentially could be what guaranteed all of these civil servants to remain on the pension funds, the sunset clauses allowed them to remain in their positions for at least 5 years after democracy. So, in that sense, there might be some legally somewhere along the line that guaranteed him recognition as a president after, the government of national unity went out of office in 1999. Then they went on to Praveen Gordhan. And my view on the whole kind of thing was that they chose two, for me, inconsequential issues in terms of the broader constituency, in terms of the broader kind of interests in the country. They've known for the land issue, number one. They could have used the 1 hour of primetime media coverage that they mugged from everyone who was watching to grandstand on the land issue. Or they could use it to grandstand on youth unemployment as an issue. Or they could have used it to grandstand on the pension fund issue. You know, the imminent raid on workers' pensions, and having used that half an hour, 1 hour to do that. Because let's remember, the reason why the strategy was successful previously was because they did it during Zuma's administration. And during Zuma's administration, we were all egging them on. Like, everyone looked at them and like, at least someone's holding him accountable, because the ANC MPs are not. So, you know, pay back the money, Zuma must go, etc., had broad public support, and them doing this in Parliament had broad public support, and it worked as a strategy because of that. In yesterday's scenario, I think it was counterproductive for themselves. Number one, because of the issues that they chose to grandstand on, because that communicates a message also that this is the most important issues that they're putting forward at probably the most important day of Parliament after the budget speech. And it also gives you kind of insight into the party itself and the thinking within the party itself in terms of not being able to come out with new strategies on how they can maintain the interest within their own constituency and the broader South African citizenry.
Yeah, look, the Clerk issue, you know, it's neither here nor there, in the sense that even if technically they are right, de Klerk has been invited for a number of years. He's been coming, and this is now their 6th year in Parliament. If he made controversial remarks, well, tomorrow if Mbeki makes controversial remarks, his critics could stand up and say, we've got an AIDS denialist in the house. He's got the blood of many people who died because they didn't have access to antiretrovirals. Next year, if Zuma has a miraculous recovery from his mysterious sickness, and he comes in, then someone would say, we have a looter in the house. So, you know, where do you draw the line? But what do you think is at the root of it? They disrupted during the Zuma era. It was the first time they did it. Media sentiment was with them. Public sentiment was with them because Zuma was suffering from a crisis of legitimacy. This time around, they were strategic. 2018, 2019, they didn't do it because they knew that sentiment was with Ramaphosa. Is it that they were desperate for the headlines once again, or is it a case that they're feeling some pressure on the VBS and they need to change the narrative and they need to profile Praveen Gordhan in a particular way, if not in the media, but at least to their own constituency?
Look, I think that with politics, we always think of when's the next election, right? So there's an election coming up next year. Yeah. So that's number one. Number two is this has always been an EFF kind of strategy. It's been a Julius Malema strategy, right? That media headlines are what allows them to punch above their weights in certain respects. It also, like these kind of theatrics, plays into the hands of the media because the media loves it and they run after them, right? And if you look at what happened, if they didn't do what they did, right, all of the headlines today would have been SONA, this is what the SONA was about, the president's speech. They, at minimum, received 50% of the coverage with relation to this specific event. The SONA and the budget speech are probably the two most watched parliamentary proceedings in the country during a 12-month period. So, you know, mugging that 1 hour of airtime off the mass media allows them to be able to communicate a message to their constituency, that they're still around, they're still actively holding accountable the executive, and they're not doing it without any pressure or whatever from anyone. So, you know, in that sense, that strategy for them has worked. It's allowed them to get the media coverage. And if you look at the lead up to this, from the EFF Congress that took place, or the EFF conference that took place in December up to this point, it's generally been quite quiet. The headlines before that, as you correctly alluded to, have largely been related to VBS. But I think in relation to Praveen, I don't think it's really related to VBS, because I think that ship has sailed and is now with the NPA. So if they were going to profile anyone, it would really be the head of the NPA, Batohi, and that pressure on her and like profiling her and so on to prevent her from bringing charges and so on. So, but I think that it's a deeper kind of personal vendetta that the EFF or Malema personally has had going back with Praveen for several years now. And targeting minorities has also been one of the playbooks of the EFF. If we think back to the Momo scenario, which was related to like the investigation of VBS and that kind of stuff. But I think specifically related to yesterday, it's largely their playbook to take media coverage with grandstanding and theatrics to communicate a message to their constituency.
It was interesting how all of this played out in terms of the rules. I mean, I interviewed Thandi Modise, the speaker, yesterday morning, and I said to her, is it not time to just change the rules? There was a place for point of orders. No one envisaged that it would come up. These things normally happen in the normal day-to-day running of Parliament. Never was there a point of order really that came up during the State of the Nation address. Everybody understood. After you sit down, the speaker announces that the president has requested a joint sitting of the two houses, and the president speaks, and when he speaks, everybody moves. Is it not time to now specifically eradicate this problem? And she said, well, it's got to do with freedom of expression and that kind of thing. And the EFF have mastered these rules. They this time around, as soon as she told them sit, the person who was standing sat and somebody else stood up. And 1.5 hours is a long time. It overshadows the Stoneham. It leads to a lot of frustration and that kind of thing. Is it time now that they relook the rules?
Definitely. I think the rules have to be looked at to be able to deal with this specific kind of disruption of Parliament. And you know what Malema referred to during the proceedings when one of the rules were quoted was that it refers to a specific member. So a specific member who's disrupting Parliament on an ongoing basis and not allowing it to proceed and not obeying the instructions of the chair and so on would then give grounds for them to be removed and evicted from Parliament or be asked to remove themselves. So, like you say, they've mastered this because one gets up and point of order and then sits down and the next one does. So, each member acting individually then means that they're not technically disrupting Parliament because everyone gets their one point of order and you have 40 EFF MPs or thereabouts, so you can have like 40 points of order and then multiple individuals speaking up and so on. So yeah, potentially tightening up the rules to say, look, anything can be referred to the various committees of Parliament or be brought up during the debate, because there's still going to be the debate of the speech that's going to take place next week, where every party is going to have their time to ask questions and all that kind of stuff. But I think, Thandi Modise, I think, dealt with it quite well. It could have been easy for her to lose her temper, to lose her cool, to then, ask them all to be removed and that kind of action. And for her saying, okay, we've dealt with this, we're going to suspend Parliament and we'll ring the bells again for everyone. Because I feel that the EFF wanted to get evicted, right? They wanted to push it to that point where the speaker says, Sergeant in Arms or whoever, remove the EFF MPs. And her saying, we can do this all night pretty much. Like, just, we'll keep going as long as you're willing to keep going. And eventually the EFF left themselves because they probably realized that they're not going to get that eviction that they wanted. So, when Parliament was reconvened, they then, did their final song and walked out and then proceedings
And also
continued.
if they were evicted, they can't be part of the debate, right? That's also one of the rules. So.
And that would have created other legal issues and probably. So, in this way...
but the rules are so... in the end, she ended up contravening the rules by allowing the different parties to speak. Because if there's only one item on the agenda, then strategically it was the right thing to do. She was getting all the parties to isolate the EFF, to condemn what they were doing. But in terms of the rules, she contravened herself then.
Yeah, but also in terms of the rules, even just speaking up and going to the mic and saying order, order, order is against the rules, right? We had the Prince, Mangasutu Buthelezi, standing there or sitting there with his hand up waiting to be recognized.
Some people don't know when to retire.
And then he goes to the microphone. He's like, I've been here with my hand up for so long, and I just had to now contravene the rules and go to the microphone because nobody was recognizing me. So if you really want to be technical about it, you can say, well, you even standing up and going to the microphone was disruptive and contravening the rules, and any member who does that, but that's the way that Parliament's been run up to that point, precedent-wise, where people would stand up and say point of order. So during the SONA, it happening isn't out of the ordinary. Look, there's a balance that needs to be struck between the rights of the MPs to be able to ask for points of order, and I think the rules definitely have to be relooked at.
Will this strategically backfire on the EFF? Because there was a bit of a contradiction that I saw in the media gallery. I was in the media gallery as they were going on. First 5-10 minutes, okay, this is expected. All of a sudden, 40-45 minutes. And within the media contingent, you started hearing people saying, this is ridiculous. They're going on for too long. Kick them out already. But then when they were kicked out, ENCA remained. And I suppose they got an issue with the EFF. But they probably would argue that, look, we came here for the State of the Nation address. We're not interested in the sideshow. But the other major media houses ran after them to go and see what Moulana had to say. Now, he gets that attention in the end of the day, even though the sentiment seems to be building up against him that, okay, this is monotonous now. You're becoming a one-trick pony.
Yeah, look, the media run behind him, but I think the sentiment's changed. And they're starting to lose media houses. Like you mentioned, ENCA, for example. Prime Media, EWN, for example, as well. The relationship or the kind of running behind Malema isn't the same as it has been, because remember there was the Malema issue with Barry Bateman, right? And remember the media can run behind him, but the sentiment or the narrative or the articles are going to say, it was ridiculous. What was the point? The debate around like de Klerk or why Praveen. So, while previously it was being, the EFF are holding Zuma accountable and they're asking him to pay back the money and it's a just cause and etc. In this scenario now, even if the media is running behind them, the narrative becomes like, was that embarrassing to the country? Was that in the best interest of democracy? So then the analysis changes in terms of our discussion as well, right? When we had this discussion 2 years ago, it was like, well, somebody's got to hold him accountable. Somebody's got to raise it. And now it's like, well, let's move on from all of this. But I think for their core constituency, this is what, maybe not the entire kind of voter base, but those who are particularly inclined towards this kind of racial chauvinism and seeing somebody stick it to racial minorities and so on. It plays to that gallery, and that's potentially how it came through or got decided as being the issue that they're gonna grandstand around, because it's one of kind of the negative undercurrents within the EFF. That's a common thread that's been going on since its formation.
All right, time for our final break. When we come back, we do a wrap of the analysis on SONA 2020. Right, welcome back. So we've been doing an analysis of SONA 2020, and our guest in studio this evening, Mohammed Kaji from ASRI. Mohammed, we have a few minutes left. We also had the 30th anniversary of the release of Nelson Mandela from prison, and President Ramaphosa started off his State of the Nation address making reference to it. He was the guy there in that iconic picture, right, as Madiba came out of prison, and in some ways there's that link. The big question yesterday in many of the interviews, especially in the morning part, was that if Mandela was alive today, would he be proud of the ANC, or would he be, deeply disappointed? Of course, no. Even the ANC would acknowledge he wouldn't be happy about the state of affairs, and there would be elements of concern. Naledi Pandor said to me in an interview that he did yesterday, he would be concerned about certain elements, but he would have also understood that things cannot be achieved in 30 years. Do you think that is accurate? Or if he had to look at the state of the country as a result of state capture, corruption, factionalism within the ANC, that he would be deeply disappointed?
I think so, and the reason that I'd say that is because we have had circumstances where, and I guess it's a similar scenario with some of those key Rivonia trialists, right? That, and I think probably the reaction of the Rivonia trialists like Uncle Kathy and Andrew Mlangeni would be a similar kind of reaction to what Madiba would have had. One of the examples I guess we could use is the case of Mbeki and AIDS denialism, and Mandela eventually going against Mbeki and coming out straightforwardly with regards to HIV policy and so on, and making the intervention and making the public statements. We saw something similar with Uncle Kathy eventually, where he came out and went against the party and wrote his letters and came out publicly in terms of questioning the direction that the ANC was going in. So I think a similar scenario would have played out, where there would have been this unhappiness that this isn't the vision that we had for the country, this isn't the vision in terms of the delivery to our people and what was being fought for. So I think, yeah, a deep disappointment privately, and then the kind of party, what would it be? Party respect or responsible party member, actions in terms of bringing it out, but in a way where it's not necessarily destroying the party or completely trashing the party, but saying it in a way where, as Naledi Pandor puts it, elements of the party or specific issues with regards to it. But also, let's make a specific point that the first 16 years, 1994 to 2008, was a story of positive change, a story of economic growth, a story of, building the welfare state and so on. And then 2008 to now has been a complete reversal back to the point at which we were in 1994. So it isn't really a kind of, 20, 25, 26 years of, negativity and degradation and so on. So, it's really been a story of the last 10 years.
Quickly before we conclude, you've heard the State of the Nation address. Are you more optimistic about 2020? Is there a realistic chance that 2020 would be a better year than 2019?
I prefer the numbers over
the talk.
Over the talk. And budget speech's coming up. I don't have very optimistic sentiments when it comes to the budget speech. My suspicions are that because of the lack in economic growth, the tax receipts are going to be less than expected, which means the budget deficit's going to be higher. And I think that obviously creates all kinds of complications in terms of the spending that's required to deliver on some of these promises. So, SONA's great, and it's the fluffy optimism and vision statement, but the realistic man will wait for the budget speech in a couple of weeks' time to make a judgment on whether 2020 is an optimistic year for the country.
Yeah, the budget speech these days almost reads like a Mayat notice. But anyway, Mohammed Kaji, Jazakallah for your time.
Jazakallah khairan, Moulana. Always a pleasure.
To the viewers, until next week, inshallah, fi amanillah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.